Number 1. Wardell Gray. We begin our descent into the shadowy, neon-lit underworld of the 1950s jazz scene in the desolate expanse of the Nevada desert. The date is May 25, 1955. This case is not merely a tragedy of a life cut short, it is a foundational story of the American nightmare, a grim testament to the terrifying grip that organized crime held over the entertainment industry during its golden age. Wardell Gray was not just a musician, he was a titan of the tenor saxophone, a man whose fluid, light tone was celebrated by critics and fans alike as the very definition of cool. He had traded solos with legends like Benny Goodman and Count Basie, bringing joy to thousands in smoke-filled clubs from Central Avenue in Los Angeles to 52nd Street in New York. But beneath the glamour, the stage lights, and the applause, Wardell was a man walking a razor-thin tightrope over a pit of vipers. Like many of the brilliant, tortured souls of his generation, he struggled with a debilitating addiction to heroin, a vulnerability that made him a target for the sharks who swam in the dark waters of the jazz world. To fully grasp the horror of his death, one must first understand the environment in which he was operating. In 1955, Las Vegas was the Wild West of show business. It was a city rising from the dust, built on the backs of gamblers and bankrolled by the Syndicate, the coalition of mob families from Chicago, New York, and Cleveland, who saw the desert as a place where they could print money. It was also a strictly segregated city, known as the Mississippi of the West, where black entertainers like Sammy Davis Jr. could perform on the Strip, but were forbidden from sleeping in the hotels or gambling at the tables. However, May 1955 marked a turning point with the opening of the Moulin Rouge Hotel. It was the first racially integrated hotel and casino in Las Vegas history, a glamorous beacon of progress located in the West Side, where black and white audiences could mix freely. Wardell Gray was booked to play in the lounge, backing the famous tap dancer Teddy Hale. It was supposed to be a triumphant moment in a pioneering venue. But the Moulin Rouge, despite its progressive facade, was still a business backed by dangerous men with ties to the underworld. The mystery began on a Wednesday night. Wardell took the stage for the first set, his saxophone singing out into the smoky air, captivating the audience with the virtuosity that had made him a star. He was at the height of his powers. But when the intermission came, Wardell stepped off the stage and walked into the shadows of history. When the band returned for the second set, his chair was empty. His instrument case sat there, a silent tomb for a voice that would never be heard again. In the jazz world, a musician missing a set was not unheard of, often attributed to a drug run or a romantic liaison. But Wardell didn't show up the next morning, or the next. The silence that followed was heavy with dread. His friends and fellow musicians began to ask questions, but in a city run by the mob, asking questions was often more dangerous than the crime itself. 2 days later, on May 26th, a gruesome discovery that shattered the facade of the glamorous casino. Wardell Gray's body was found miles out in the scrubland of the desert, lying face down in the dirt, baking in the relentless sun. He had been discarded like refuse, miles away from the city lights. The Clark County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene, and almost immediately the machinery of a cover-up began to turn. The official report released to the press was simple, sanitary, and convenient. Wardell Gray had died of a drug overdose. The narrative spun by the authorities was that he had been partying with friends, shot up too much heroin, and died accidentally. In a panic, his companions had supposedly driven him out to the desert and dumped the body to avoid legal trouble. It was a story that fit the stereotypes of the time, the tragic, junkie jazz musician who destroyed himself. The case was quickly closed, the coroner ruling it an accident. But the jazz community, the people who knew the streets and the men who ran them, never believed the official story. They whispered the truth in the back of tour buses and in the dressing rooms of clubs across America. The truth was written on Wardell's body, a truth that the official reports tried to erase. According to later investigations and biographers like Bill Moody, the physical evidence told a much more violent story. Wardell Gray's neck was broken. There were severe blunt force trauma wounds to his head. A man dying of a heroin overdose slips into a coma. He does not snap his own spine. He does not beat himself to death. The condition of the body suggested a violent struggle, a beating, or a fall from a height. The dumped body theory was a lie designed to protect the reputation of the newly opened casino and its shadowy investors. The prevailing theories regarding his death are chilling because they expose the ruthless infrastructure of Las Vegas in the 1950s. The most widely accepted theory is that Wardell Gray owed a significant gambling debt to the mob. The Moulin Rouge, for all its glitz, was struggling financially, and the men behind it were not the type to forgive debts. In the Mafia's code, a debt is a bond that can only be broken by payment or blood. If Wardell had borrowed money to feed his addiction or his gambling habit and couldn't pay it back, the broken neck was not an accident. It was a message. It was a brutal demonstration of power, a warning to everyone else on the payroll. Another, even darker theory suggests that Wardell was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some historians believe that during the intermission, he wandered into a back room or an office at the Moulin Rouge and witnessed something he was never meant to see. A mob hit, a payoff to a corrupt politician, or a high-level drug transaction involving the casino's management. In this scenario, Wardell wasn't killed for what he owed, he was killed for what he knew. He was a loose end that needed to be snipped. The haste with which the body was disposed of and the clumsiness of the overdose cover-up suggested a panic to silence a witness before he could talk. The cover-up itself was a masterclass in corruption. The coroner who performed the autopsy was allegedly on the mob's payroll, a common arrangement in 1950s Vegas to ensure that unfortunate incidents didn't scare away the tourists or bring heat from the FBI. A murder investigation at the high-profile integrated Moulin Rouge would have been a disaster for business. It would have brought scrutiny that the mob could not afford. So they erased the broken neck from the headlines. They painted Wardell as a victim of his own vices, effectively assassinating his character to hide his murder. Jet magazine and other publications ran with the overdose story, and the public moved on. Months later, the Moulin Rouge closed its doors under mysterious circumstances, its brief experiment in integration ending as abruptly as Wardell's life. This story forces us to confront the price of fame in an era of segregation and organized crime. Wardell Gray was a musical genius who helped define the sound of a century, but to the men who ran the city, he was just a disposable asset. He was a black man in a white man's desert, a junkie in a gangster's paradise. His death was a grim reminder that while the music was beautiful, the business was lethal. He was trapped in a web he couldn't escape, squeezed between the racism of the law and the brutality of the outlaw. His saxophone was found later, pawned or left behind, a silent witness to the end of a virtuoso. The music stopped, but the mystery continues to echo. The tragedy of Wardell Gray is not just that he died, but that his death was stolen from him. He was denied justice, denied the dignity of the truth, and buried under a lie that has persisted for 70 years. It stands as a stark opening to our list because it sets the scene perfectly. We are not just talking about music, we are talking about an industry built on blood money. Wardell Gray didn't die because he played a wrong note. He died because he played the wrong game with the wrong people. And in the 1950s, that was a death sentence with no appeal. So, I have to ask you, do you believe the official police report that Wardell Gray simply overdosed, or do you believe, like most of the jazz world, that a broken neck is the signature of a mob execution? Was he silenced for what he saw or for what he owed? Tell me your verdict in the comments below. But while Wardell Gray was taken into the silent desert to die, our next legend was executed in the most public way imaginable. We are leaving the quiet sands of Nevada and heading to a crowded bar in Harlem, New York. This man revolutionized rhythm, a man who thought he could slap a gangster and live to tell about it. He was wrong, and the killer didn't just shoot him, he played the victim's own hit song while watching him bleed out. Get ready for the story of the Jukebox execution.
Number 2. Chano Pozo. We leave the desolate, wind-swept silence of the Nevada desert and plunge headfirst into the rhythmic, steam-filled, and dangerous streets of Harlem, New York. The date is December 2nd, 1948. This story transports us from the hidden conspiracies of the mob to the raw, visceral violence of the street corner. It takes us into the heart of a musical revolution that changed the sonic landscape of America forever. A revolution led by a man who believed he was invincible. Luciano Chano Pozo was not merely a percussionist, he was a force of nature, a Cuban powerhouse who brought the ancient rhythms of Africa to the sophisticated world of American jazz. But Chano was also a man who lived by the code of the Havana backstreets, a code where pride was worth more than life itself and where disrespect was a capital offense. This is the story of how the godfather of Afro-Cuban jazz was executed in a public bar while his own hit song played as the soundtrack to his death. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, you must first understand the man. Chano Pozo was a legend long before he arrived in New York. In Havana, he was royalty. He was a member of the Abacua, a secret society derived from West African traditions, known for their fierce loyalty and reputation for violence. Chano carried the scars of his upbringing, literally. He had been shot and stabbed in Cuba during street brawls, surviving wounds that would have killed lesser men. He believed he was protected by the spirits, bulletproof and untouchable. When he came to America in 1947 to join Dizzy Gillespie's band, he didn't leave that identity at customs. He brought the fire of the Abacua with him. Together, Chano and Dizzy created Kubop, a fusion that hit the jazz world like a nuclear bomb. They co-wrote Menteca, a song that became an anthem, blending bebop harmonies with a driving primal conga beat. Chano was a superstar, mesmerizing audiences at Carnegie Hall, stripping his shirt off to pound the drums with bleeding hands. But offstage, he remained a man of the streets, navigating Harlem with a large knife in his boot and a dangerous arrogance in his stride. The incident that led to one of the most cinematic murders in music history began with something incredibly trivial, a detail that highlights the senselessness of street violence. Chano, like many musicians of the era who sought relief from the grueling road schedule, used marijuana. On that freezing December day, he had purchased a packet of weed from a local dealer named Eusebio Munoz, known on the street as El Cabito. El Cabito was not a major crime boss. He was a small-time hustler, a World War II veteran who had seen combat and returned to Harlem to scrape by in the underworld. He was a man who survived by maintaining a reputation for danger. When Chano inspected the merchandise later that day, he was furious. He believed the marijuana was synthetic, fake, or just poor quality. He felt cheated. But, more importantly, in the machismo culture Chano embodied, being ripped off was a direct insult to his manhood. It was a challenge. He hunted El Cabito down in the street earlier that day, screaming at him in a mix of broken English and Spanish. And then he did the unthinkable. He slapped the dealer across the face in public. It was a moment of supreme arrogance. Chano thought he was disciplining a subordinate. He didn't realize he had just signed his own death warrant. You might slap a man in a bar fight, but you do not slap a gunman in 1940s Harlem and expect to walk away. Later that night, the temperature dropped and snow began to mix with the grime of the city streets. Chano Pozo walked into the El Rio bar at 111th Street and Lenox Avenue. It was a popular spot for the Latino community in Harlem, a long, narrow room filled with cigarette smoke, the smell of fried plantains and spilled beer, and the sound of laughter. Chano was a regular here. It was his domain. He marched in, likely looking to continue the argument or demand his money back, his pride still stinging from the earlier transaction. He spotted El Cabito sitting quietly at a table near the back, eating dinner. The atmosphere in the bar shifted instantly. The regulars knew what had happened earlier. They knew El Cabito's reputation. The air grew thick with tension. The jukebox was playing, people were drinking, but eyes were darting toward the confrontation about to unfold. Chano approached the table, his chest puffed out, ready to intimidate the smaller man again. He didn't know that El Cabito had spent the hours since the slap seething, preparing, and waiting. El Cabito didn't stand up to fight. He didn't shout back. He didn't engage in a brawl that Chano, with his massive physical strength, would surely win. Instead, El Cabito calmly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a German Luger pistol, a souvenir from his time in the war or tool of his trade. The room froze. Before Chano could react, before he could reach for the knife in his boot or turn to run, the first shot rang out. It hit Chano in the stomach, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The great drummer staggered back, a look of shock replacing his anger. He grabbed his abdomen, stumbling toward the center of the room. But El Cabito was not finished. This was not a warning. This was an execution. He stood up and continued to fire, methodically pumping bullet after bullet into the jazz legend. One shot followed another, bang, 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 until Chano Pozo's body was riddled with 7 bullets. He collapsed onto the dirty tile floor, his white suit rapidly turning crimson with blood. The music of the bar was replaced by the ringing in the ears of the terrified patrons. The violence was shocking enough, but what happened next is the detail that has turned this murder into dark folklore. It is a moment of cold-blooded psychological warfare that seems too scripted to be true, yet witnesses swore to it. After emptying his clip and ensuring that Chano was dead, El Cabito didn't run out the back door. He didn't scream or panic. He stood over the body of the famous musician, looking down at the destruction he had caused. Then, with a chilling calmness, he walked over to the jukebox in the corner of the bar. The patrons were screaming, scrambling under tables, but El Cabito ignored them. He fished a nickel out of his pocket, slotted it into the machine, and made a selection. The song he chose was Manteca, Chano Pozo's own biggest hit, the song that had made him a star. As the police sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the Harlem night, the upbeat, explosive horn lines of Dizzy Gillespie and the driving, thunderous conga rhythms of Chano Pozo blasted from the speakers. El Cabito stood there, listening to the ghost of the man he had just killed. It was the ultimate act of dominance. He had taken Chano's life, and now he was controlling his voice. He forced the dying man and the terrified crowd to listen to the talent he had just extinguished. It was a macabre serenade, a final insult delivered in 4/4 time. When the NYPD arrived, they found a scene of carnage, the greatest percussionist in the world lying dead while his own drums thundered ironically in the air above him. The news of Chano's death sent shockwaves through the music world. Dizzy Gillespie was in Europe when he heard the news, and he was devastated. He knew that the unique alchemy they had created was gone forever. The bridge from Havana to Harlem was burned down. The newspapers, including the New York Times, reported it as a drug dispute, a sordid end for a brilliant artist. El Cabito was eventually arrested and served time for the murder, claiming self-defense, arguing that Chano had threatened him. But to the community, it was clear what this was. It was the street code in its most brutal form. Chano brought the fire of the Abacua to the stage, but he forgot that the streets of New York had no respect for tradition or talent. In the end, a $5 bag of bad weed and a moment of bruised ego cost the world decades of music. Chano Pozo was only 33 years old. He died because he forgot that in the underworld, everyone is armed and no one is a fan. So I have to ask you, do you think Chano's tough guy persona is what ultimately got him killed, or was he just a victim of a violent time and place? Does the fact that the killer played his song on the jukebox make this the most cold-blooded act of disrespect you've ever heard? Tell me your thoughts on the street code in the comments below. But while Chano Pozo was gunned down in the heat of an argument in a crowded bar, our next legend faced a death that was cold, silent, and shrouded in 50 years of mystery. We are moving from the chaotic noise of Harlem to the freezing, murky waters of the East River. Our next victim was a prophet of free jazz who disappeared for 20 days, only to be found tied to a heavy object in the water. Rumor has it the mob tried to erase him for refusing to bow to their demands. Get ready for the story of the East River mystery.
Number 3. Albert Ayler. We move from the bloody floor of a Harlem bar to the freezing, murky depths of the East River, shifting our focus from a crime of sudden passion to a mystery that has rotted in the water for over 50 years. The date is November 25th, 1970. This story takes us into the most avant-garde, spiritual, and misunderstood corners of the jazz world, where the music was not just entertainment, but a religious experience. It involves a man who was called the Holy Ghost, a saxophonist who screamed through his instrument in search of universal peace, but who ultimately met a violent, cold, and silent end. This is the story of Albert Ayler and the persistent, terrifying legend that he was executed by the mob and anchored to the bottom of the river by the very machine that refused to play his music, a jukebox. To comprehend the gravity of Albert Ayler's death, one must first grasp the intensity of his life. By 1970, Ayler was a polarizing giant in the free jazz movement. He was not playing the toe-tapping swing of the 1940s or the cool bop of the 1950s. His music was raw, chaotic, and primal, a sonic assault that sounded like a choir of angels screaming or a nervous breakdown captured on vinyl. Critics were divided. Some called him a genius who was speaking directly to God, while others dismissed his work as noise. But regardless of the critics, Ayler was a man deeply committed to a spiritual path. He wore a beard that gave him the appearance of a prophet, and he spoke of music as a healing force for a broken world. However, the world he inhabited, New York City in the gritty, decaying 1970s, was not interested in healing. It was a city of predators, drug epidemics, and organized crime that had its tentacles wrapped tight around the music industry. Albert Ayler, with his head in the clouds, was walking barefoot on a floor covered in broken glass. The timeline of the tragedy begins on November 5th, 1970. Albert had been acting erratically in the weeks leading up to this date. His girlfriend and partner, Mary Parks, later recounted that Albert was consumed by fear. He wasn't just anxious, he was terrified. He spoke of blood and evil forces closing in on him. He took down the pictures in their apartment and smashed a saxophone, an act of desperation for a musician. On the night of November 5th, following an argument with Mary, Albert walked out of their Brooklyn apartment and into the cold autumn night. He took the ferry to the Statue of Liberty, a symbolic journey, but he never returned. For 20 agonizing days, there was silence. His family searched, the jazz community whispered, but the city had swallowed him whole. In a metropolis where people vanished every day, a missing black jazz musician was not a priority for the NYPD. On November 25th, the crackle of a police radio broke. The NYPD Harbor Unit had spotted a body floating near the Congress Street Pier in Brooklyn, bobbing in the polluted, freezing waters of the East River. It was Albert Ayler. The condition of the body was the stuff of nightmares. After 3 weeks in the water, he was bloated and decomposed, stripped of his identity and his humanity. The official identification had to be made through fingerprints because his face was unrecognizable. The police, eager to close a case that would likely yield no leads and required too much paperwork, quickly labeled it a suicide. Their theory was simple. The tortured artist, overwhelmed by the commercial failure of his records and his own mental instability, had jumped into the river to end it all. The coroner listed the cause of death as asphyxia by drowning. Case closed. But the case was never closed for the people who knew him, nor for the historians who have studied the dark underbelly of the jazz business. The suicide theory had gaping holes that the water couldn't wash away. First, there was the physical evidence, or the lack thereof. When the family finally saw the body, they noted strange anomalies. There was a rumor, later substantiated by family members, of a hole in the back of his skull, suggesting a bullet wound or a blow from a heavy object, but the autopsy report was frustratingly vague, noting no obvious trauma despite the decomposition. Furthermore, the East River was not a typical suicide spot for a man living in his neighborhood. It was, however, a notorious dumping ground for the Mafia. In the 1970s, if you wanted a body to disappear, you didn't leave it in the street, you gave it to the river. This brings us to the most chilling and persistent theory surrounding his death, the jukebox execution.
For decades, a specific gruesome detail has circulated in the jazz underground. The story goes that Albert didn't jump, he was thrown. The theory posits that Albert had run afoul of the Black Mafia, or local drug syndicates that controlled the club scene in Brooklyn and Harlem. Perhaps he owed a gambling debt, or maybe he had refused to pay the extortion fees often demanded of artists to play in certain venues. Some even suggest that radical political factions were pressuring him to make his music more militant, and he refused. The legend says that hitmen came to his home or intercepted him on the street, killed him, and then, to ensure the body would sink and never be found, they tied him to a heavy object. The grim poetry of the rumor is that they tied him to a discarded jukebox. It is a symbol so heavy with irony, it feels like a scene from a noir film. A jukebox is a machine that plays the hits, the commercial music that Albert rejected and that the industry rejected him for. To be chained to the very symbol of commercialism and dragged to the bottom of the river is a metaphor for his entire career. While no jukebox was ever recovered, and indeed, if it successfully anchored him, it wouldn't be, the fact that his body eventually floated to the surface suggests that whatever weighed him down, be it a machine, cinder blocks, or chains, eventually broke loose as the body decomposed. The carelessness of the investigation is a damning piece of evidence. In 1970, the death of an experimental black musician was treated with bureaucratic indifference. There was no murder investigation, no interviewing the dealers or loan sharks who operated in his neighborhood. The police saw a floater and wrote it off. This negligence allowed the killers, if there were killers, to walk away into the shadows, leaving behind only rumors and a decomposed corpse. Biographers who wrote Holy Ghost dug deep into this, finding that Mary Parks believed until her dying day that he was murdered. She cited the fact that Albert, despite his mental struggles, was deeply religious and viewed suicide as a sin. He was planning new music. He was trying to book gigs. These are not the actions of a man planning to jump off a pier. This story forces us to confront the silencing of the spirit. Albert Ayler tried to play music that transcended the physical world, music that was about spirit and peace, yet his physical body was subjected to the most brutal earthly indignity possible. If the mob theory is true, it highlights the terrifying reality that no one was untouchable. You could be a prophet, a genius, a star, but if you owed money to the wrong people in New York City, you were just meat. The East River keeps its secrets. We may never know if there was a bullet in his skull or a chain around his waist, but the silence that followed his death is louder than any note he ever played. We are left with a haunting image, the man who screamed for peace, floating in the freezing cold darkness, ignored by the city that crushed him. It is a reminder that the music industry is exactly that, an industry, and it has a body count. Did Albert Ayler break under the weight of his own genius, or was he broken by the enforcers of a corrupt system? The difference is the difference between a tragedy and a crime. So, I have to ask you, do you believe the police report that a spiritual man committed suicide, or do you believe the persistent jukebox theory that he was executed by the underworld? Does the alleged hole in the back of his head prove that this was a hit? Let me know your verdict in the comments. But while Albert Ayler's death was shrouded in the murky waters of mystery, our next legend's death was shockingly clear, violent, and happened in the middle of a European capital. We are leaving New York and flying to Amsterdam. Our next victim was the Prince of Cool, a man with the face of an angel and the habits of a demon. He survived decades of heroin addiction, but he couldn't survive the drug dealers who came to collect. He fell from a hotel window, but gravity wasn't the only thing that pulled him down. Get ready for the story of the defenestration of a jazz idol.
Number 4. Chet Baker. We leave the murky waters of New York and cross the Atlantic to the rain-slicked cobblestone streets of Amsterdam. The date is Friday the 13th, May 1988. This story is the tragic, violent climax of a life that was one long, beautiful, and terrifying slow-motion car crash. It concerns a man who was once the prettiest face in America, the James Dean of jazz, the Prince of Cool. Chet Baker was a trumpeter and vocalist who defined the West Coast sound with a voice like a whisper and a horn that sounded like heartbreak. But behind the chiseled jawline and the soft notes lay a demon that consumed him for decades, a heroin addiction so severe that it dictated every move he made, every country he visited, and ultimately the violent manner of his death. This is the story of how an American icon fell from a window in the red light district, and the persistent, dark theory that he didn't fall but was pushed by the drug syndicate he had tried to outrun. To understand the darkness of his end, you must understand the brightness of his beginning and the shadow that followed it. In the 1950s, Chet Baker was a god. He was photographed by William Claxton, adored by fans, and envied by peers. But as his fame grew, so did his appetite for heroin. By the 1960s, Chet was no longer just a musician. He was a professional junkie who played the trumpet to fund his habit. He lived in a dangerous world of dealers, hustlers, and thieves. He learned the hard way that the drug underworld does not care about art. In 1966, in San Francisco, Chet was savagely beaten by drug dealers he had tried to con. They didn't just break his ribs, they targeted his livelihood. They smashed his teeth out, ruining his embouchure, the way a trumpet player shapes their mouth. It took him years to relearn his instrument with dentures. This incident proved that Chet was a target, a man who consistently crossed dangerous people. He survived that beating, but 20 years later, in Amsterdam, his luck finally ran out. The scene of the crime was the Hotel Prince Hendrik, a modest establishment located across from Central Station on the edge of the notorious Zeedijk neighborhood, an area then known as Heroin Alley. Chet had checked in to room 210. He was 58 years old, his face lined and ravaged by years of abuse, a ghost of the beauty he once was. He was in Europe to perform, but as always, his primary mission was scoring. On the night of May 12th, Chet was reportedly desperate. He needed a fix. He was alone in a foreign city, navigating a network of Turkish and Surinamese dealers who controlled the heroin trade in Amsterdam. These were not the romanticized gangsters of movies. These were ruthless businessmen who viewed addicts as walking wallets. At approximately 3 a.m. on May 13th, a scream pierced the quiet of the night, followed by a sickening thud. A passerby found a man lying crumpled on the concrete sidewalk below the hotel. His head had struck a stone post, crushing his skull instantly. He was curled in a fetal position, his trumpet left upstairs in his room. When police arrived, they identified the body as Chesney Henry Baker, Jr. The room was locked from the inside, according to the initial cursory report. They found heroin and cocaine in the room and in his bloodstream. The Dutch police, much like the NYPD with Albert Ayler, saw a dead junkie and shrugged. They ruled it an accidental fall while under the influence. They theorized he might have been trying to climb to the adjacent balcony to retrieve cigarettes or let someone in, slipped, and fell to his death. It was a tragic, clumsy end. But to those who knew Chet, and to those who study the mechanics of mob violence, the accident theory is a convenient fiction. The push theory suggests that Chet Baker was murdered. The timeline of his final hours is filled with red flags. Witnesses reported that earlier in the evening, Chet was agitated. He was looking for drugs but had very little money. The rumor that has persisted in the jazz underworld is that Chet had burned, stolen from, or underpaid a group of Rotterdam-based dealers who supplied the Amsterdam circuit. In the drug world, word travels fast. If you owe money in Rotterdam, you owe money in Amsterdam. The theory posits that the dealers came to room 210 to collect a debt or punish him for a past transgression. Forensic inconsistencies support the murder theory. Friends and biographers have pointed out that the window in room 210 did not open fully. It was a sash window that only opened a certain amount, making it difficult for a man to accidentally fall out of it, unless he was leaning far out or was forced. Instead, he landed a distance away, striking the post with significant force, suggesting he was propelled or thrown outward. The locked door is often cited as proof of solitude, but in the world of professional hits, locking a door behind you with a passkey or through the transom is a basic skill. Or perhaps someone was already in the room with him, a guest he invited in to buy from, who turned on him when the money wasn't there. There is also the psychological aspect.
Chet Baker was a survivor. He had survived prison in Italy, deportation from Germany, and the brutal beating in San Francisco. He was street smart. The idea that he would foolishly try to scale a wet building facade at 3 a.m. for cigarettes seems out of character for a man who knew how to navigate danger. It seems far more likely that he was backed into a corner. Imagine the scene, the Prince of Cool pleading with men who didn't care about his records, only his debt. The argument escalates, a struggle ensues, and then the final, terrifying shove into the night air. It was a defenestration, a classic method of execution, because it looks like a suicide or an accident, requiring little cleanup and leaving no bullet casings. The aftermath of his death was a somber reflection of his chaotic life. His body lay on the street for hours before being removed. The hotel has since become a macabre pilgrimage site for fans, with a plaque memorializing him. But the justice system failed him. There was no homicide investigation. No one interviewed the dealers in the Z-Dike. No one tracked down the people Chet had called that night. He was written off as collateral damage in the war on drugs. His death marked the end of an era, silencing one of the most unique voices in American history. He died as he lived, high, alone, and in trouble. This story forces us to confront the glamour versus reality of the jazz life. We romanticize the tortured artist, but there is nothing romantic about having your head crushed on an Amsterdam sidewalk because you owe money to a heroin syndicate. Chet Baker's fall was the physical manifestation of his spiritual descent. He had been falling for 30 years. The pavement was just the thing that finally caught him. It raises the question of culpability. Is the addict responsible for his own demise, or is the predatory system that feeds him guilty of murder when the check bounces? So I have to ask you, do you accept the police conclusion that Chet Baker simply slipped while high, or do you believe the darker theory that he was thrown from that window as a brutal receipt for unpaid deaths? Was this gravity, or was it a gangland eviction? Tell me your verdict in the comments below. But while Chet Baker's death was a lonely fall in a foreign city, our next legend's death was a brazen, loud, and public execution in the heart of the Motor City. We are leaving the canals of Amsterdam and heading to Detroit. Our next victim was a pioneer who invented a new way of singing, but he couldn't sing his way out of a drive-by shooting. He was gunned down outside a famous club by a disgruntled dancer, proving that in Detroit, even the innovators aren't safe. Get ready for the story of the drive-by at the Keyboard Lounge.
Number 5. Eddie Jefferson. We leave the rain-slicked cobblestones of Amsterdam and descend into the gritty industrial heart of America, Detroit, Michigan. The date is May 8, 1979. This story shifts our focus from the international drug syndicates to the raw, personal violence of the street hustle. It takes us to the Motor City at the end of a turbulent decade, a city that was bleeding jobs, hope, and population, but was still fighting to keep its musical soul alive. This is the story of Eddie Jefferson, a man who didn't just play jazz, he reinvented it. He was the father of vocalese, an art form where a singer puts lyrics to a famous instrumental jazz solo, literally giving a voice to the horn. But while Eddie spent his life giving a voice to the music, a disgruntled associate with a shotgun decided to silence him forever in a parking lot execution that shook the jazz world to its core. To understand the magnitude of this loss, you have to appreciate the genius of Eddie Jefferson. Born in 1918, Eddie was a tap dancer and a vocalist who heard things differently. When he listened to a saxophone solo by Coleman Hawkins or Lester Young, he didn't just hear notes, he heard words. He pioneered the technique of writing intricate, poetic lyrics that matched the exact melody of improvised solos. His masterpiece, Moody's Mood for Love, based on a James Moody solo, became a standard. By 1979, Eddie was experiencing a career renaissance. He was 60 years old, an elder statesman of the genre, touring with Richie Cole. He was beloved, a mentor to younger cats, and a living link to the golden age of bebop. He was performing at Baker's Keyboard Lounge, the world's oldest operating jazz club, a holy site for musicians. Baker's is famous for its Art Deco design and its bar shaped like a giant piano. It was supposed to be a place of celebration, a sanctuary, but on that May night, the sanctuary became a slaughterhouse.
The atmosphere in Detroit in 1979 was heavy. The city was struggling with economic collapse and rising crime rates. The streets were dangerous and the tension was palpable. Eddie had just finished the last set of the night. The club was clearing out, the applause fading into the clinking of glasses and the shuffling of chairs. Eddie, feeling good about the performance, walked out of the club's side exit onto Livernois Avenue. He was with Richie Cole, laughing, perhaps talking about the next gig or the meal they were about to eat. It was around 1:35 a.m. The air was cool. Eddie was heading toward a waiting car, ready to go back to his hotel. He had no idea that a ghost from his recent past was waiting for him in the darkness. The killer was a man named Amir al-Mumin. He was not a mob boss or a cartel enforcer. He was a bitter, failed tap dancer who existed on the fringes of the scene. Amir had once worked with Eddie, perhaps sharing the stage as a dancer, but Eddie had fired him or severed ties with him. The exact details of the dispute were muddled, likely a mix of money, professional jealousy, and perceived disrespect. In the mind of the killer, Eddie Jefferson wasn't a legend. He was the man standing in the way of his success. Amir had been stalking the gig, waiting for the right moment. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion. It was a premeditated ambush. As Eddie stepped onto the sidewalk, a dark green Lincoln Continental rolled slowly down the street. It didn't speed up, it prowled. As it pulled parallel to the jazz legend, the window rolled down. There were no words exchanged, no final argument, just the deafening roar of a shotgun blast. The shot was fired at close range. It hit Eddie Jefferson squarely in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward onto the pavement. The force of the blast was catastrophic. Richie Cole, standing just feet away, was miraculously unharmed physically, but mentally scarred for life. He watched his mentor and friend bleed out on the concrete of the parking lot. The green Lincoln sped off into the Detroit night, leaving behind the smell of gunpowder and the silence of death. The brutality of the act was stunning. This was a drive-by shooting, a tactic usually associated with gang wars against a 60-year-old jazz singer. It was cowardly and precise. Eddie Jefferson was pronounced dead at Mount Carmel Mercy Hospital shortly after arrival. The voice that had navigated the most complex bebop melodies was stilled by a single pull of a trigger. The police investigation was swift, largely because the killer hadn't been particularly careful about hiding his grudge. Witnesses identified the car, and the jazz community knew about the bad blood between Eddie and the dancer. Amir al-Mumin was arrested and later convicted of the murder, but the arrest did little to heal the wound in the music world. The senselessness of it was overwhelming. Eddie hadn't been killed for a gambling debt or a drug deal gone wrong. He was killed because of crabs in a bucket mentality. He was killed by a hanger-on who couldn't handle his own failure and decided to destroy someone else's success. It was a street execution in the truest sense. Ego, jealousy, and a gun, resolving a dispute that should have ended with a conversation. So I have to ask you, do you think this was purely the act of a madman, or does it speak to a toxic jealousy that permeates the music industry? Is the failed artist the most dangerous person in the room? And does the fact that he was shot outside a historic jazz club make this feel like a desecration of holy ground? Tell me your thoughts on the price of envy in the comments below. But while Eddie Jefferson was gunned down by a jealous rival in a parking lot, our next legend faced a much more intimate and terrifying betrayal inside his own home. We are leaving the streets of Detroit and heading to Memphis, Tennessee. Our next victim was the heartbeat of soul music, the man who kept time for Stax Records. He survived the collapse of a musical empire, but he couldn't survive the intruders who made him kneel on his living room floor. Was it a robbery, or was it a contract hit ordered by someone he slept next to? Get ready for the story of the execution of the human timekeeper.
Number 6. Al Jackson Jr. We leave the cold concrete parking lot in Detroit and travel south to the soulful, sweltering heat of Memphis, Tennessee. The date is October 1, 1975. This story shifts the narrative from the public violence of the street to the terrifying intimacy of a home invasion execution. It takes us into the heart of the Memphis sound, a city that gave birth to rock and roll and soul, but also a city that was drowning in corruption, financial ruin, and blood. This is the story of Al Jackson Jr., the man known as the Human Timekeeper. He was the drummer for Booker T and the MGs, the session legend who played on Green Onions, Soul Man, and Let's Stay Together. He provided the heartbeat for an entire generation. But on a rainy October night, that heartbeat was stopped by 5 bullets in the back, in a crime that remains one of the music industry's most disturbing unsolved mysteries, a mystery that reeks of betrayal, bankruptcy, and a contract killing masked as a robbery. To understand why Al Jackson had to die, you must understand the crumbling empire he was standing on. In 1975, Stax Records, the legendary label that Al helped build, was in freefall. It was a kingdom of soul that had rotted from the inside out. The label was bankrupt, embroiled in massive lawsuits, and investigated by the IRS. There were rumors of missing money, check kiting, and heavy involvement with loan sharks and unsavory characters who were circling the dying company like vultures. Al Jackson was one of the few people at Stax who still had money and a future. He was planning to leave Memphis, to move to Atlanta and start fresh with a new production company. He was looking for an exit strategy from the toxic environment of Memphis. But in the world of high-stakes music business, trying to leave with your secrets and your money can be a fatal mistake. However, the threat wasn't just coming from the boardroom, it was coming from his own bedroom. Al's personal life was as chaotic as the label he worked for. He was in the middle of a volatile, violent divorce from his wife, Barbara Jackson. Their relationship was a war zone. In July 1975, just months before his death, Barbara had shot Al in the chest during a domestic dispute. He survived, but decided not to press charges, perhaps hoping to de-escalate the situation or keep his private life out of the papers. He had moved out of the family home and was staying at a hotel, but he continued to check on her. It was a fatal attachment. On the night of September 30th, Al attended a screening of the Ali Frazier Thriller in Manila fight. He was in good spirits. Afterward, tragically, he decided to return to his home at 4566 Minden Road to check on Barbara. He arrived late, expecting perhaps an argument or a quiet night. What he walked into was an ambush. According to Barbara's testimony, when Al arrived, she was already being held hostage. She claimed that unknown intruders had broken in, tied her up, and were waiting for him. But the details of the crime scene tell a story that police found baffling. When Al entered the house, the intruders didn't just rob him, they didn't just take his wallet or his jewelry, they forced him onto his knees on the floor of the hallway. It was a ritual of submission. Al Jackson Jr., the man who had commanded the rhythm of millions of records, was made to bow down in his own home. Then the gunman stood behind him and fired 5 shots into his back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was not a struggle, it was an execution. It was the method of a professional, cold, efficient, and final. After the shots were fired, the intruders fled. Barbara Jackson, who had been tied up, managed to escape the house and run to a neighbor screaming for help. She had been shot in the leg, a flesh wound that some investigators later viewed with suspicion. Was she a victim, or was it a staged injury to make her look like one? The police arrived to find the human timekeeper dead on the floor, but as they canvassed the scene, the robbery theory began to fall apart. While some items were disturbed, Al's wallet was reportedly still in his pocket. Expensive jewelry was left behind. If this was a burglary, it was the most incompetent burglary in Memphis history. Burglars don't execute people execution style unless they are surprised, and they certainly don't wait for the homeowner to return just to kill him. This was a hit. The theories surrounding his death split into 2 dark paths, both leading to the same bloody conclusion. The first theory points to the collapse of Stax Records. Rumors swirled that Al knew too much about the missing millions, the illegal dealings, and the bank fraud that brought the label down. He was preparing to testify, or perhaps just leaving town with knowledge that could send powerful men to prison. In this version, the hit was ordered by the money men, the shadowy figures who were stripping the carcass of Stax Records.
They hired professionals to silence him before he could start his new life in Atlanta. The second and more widely believed theory points to the domestic war. The police looked hard at Barbara Jackson. The fact that she had shot him just months prior was impossible to ignore. The intruders were rumored to be hired guns, perhaps connected to the boyfriend of a friend or local thugs paid to stage a robbery. The theory suggests that Barbara, fearing a divorce settlement that would leave her with nothing, or perhaps driven by the same rage that led her to shoot him in July, arranged the hit. The shot to her leg was seen by skeptics as a way to clear her name, a sympathy wound. However, the evidence was circumstantial. No gun was found. The intruders were never identified. Barbara was never charged with her murder. The tragedy of Al Jackson Jr. is the tragedy of a man surrounded by sharks. He was the backbone of Stax, the reliable, steady beat that held everything together. But when the music stopped, he was left exposed. He was killed in the city he helped put on the map, in the house he bought with his talent, by people who likely knew his name. The investigation ran cold. Memphis in the 1970s was a city where police files often disappeared, and where crimes involving the black community, even famous musicians, were often deprioritized. The killer walked away into the rain, leaving the Green Onions drummer silent forever. This story forces us to confront the enemy within. We often fear the stranger in the alley, but statistics show that murder is usually an intimate affair. Al walked into his own home, a place that should have been his castle, and found a firing squad. Whether it was the greedy executives of a failing record label or the toxic rage of a failing marriage, the result was the same. A legend was erased. The void he left was immense. Al Jackson Jr. wasn't just a drummer. He was a producer, a writer, a visionary. He was preparing to produce a comeback album for Al Green. He had the world at his feet. His death signaled the final nail in the coffin of the golden age of Memphis soul. Stax closed its doors shortly after, the magic gone, the rhythm section dismantled by a .38 caliber pistol. So, I have to ask you, do you believe this was a corporate hit to cover up the Stax Records fraud? Or do you believe the domestic theory that the wife who shot him once finally finished the job? Does the fact that nothing of value was stolen prove that the motive was pure hatred? Tell me your verdict on the Memphis murder in the comments below. But while Al Jackson was executed in the privacy of his home, our next legend faced a terror that he believed was supernatural. We are leaving the soul studios of Memphis and traveling back in time to the jazz clubs of the 1930s Washington, D.C. Our next victim was the self-proclaimed inventor of jazz. He spent his final years convinced that the mob had put a voodoo curse on him. He was stabbed at a club, but he claimed it was the Syndicate that held the knife. Get ready for the story of the curse of the first jazzman.
Number 7. Jelly Roll Morton. We travel back in time to the smoky, segregated twilight of 1938, to the streets of Washington, D.C. This story takes us to the very roots of the genre, to the man who famously and controversially claimed to have invented jazz itself in 1902. This is the story of Ferdinand Jelly Roll Morton, a Creole pianist with a diamond in his tooth and a revolver on his piano. But while Morton was a giant of the early jazz era, a man who lived large and spoke louder, his end was a slow, agonizing descent into paranoia and violence. He died convinced that he was the victim of a conspiracy that blended the supernatural with the criminal. He believed the Syndicate, the early Mafia, had put a voodoo curse on him to destroy his life. And in a terrifying twist, it was a knife in a mob-linked nightclub that sealed his fate, proving that sometimes paranoia is just a heightened state of awareness. To understand the tragedy of Jelly Roll Morton, you must understand the magnitude of his ego and his fall. In the 1920s, Morton was the king. His band, the Red Hot Peppers, produced some of the most sophisticated and driving jazz ever recorded. He was a pimp, a pool shark, a hustler, and a musical genius rolled into one. He wore $1,000 suits and carried a bankroll that could choke a horse.
But by the late 1930s, the Depression had hit, and the swing era had arrived. The music business had changed. It had become industrialized, and with industry came the sharks. The Mafia began to muscle in on the jazz clubs, the jukeboxes, and the publishing rights. Morton, a man of immense pride who refused to be told what to do, found himself pushed to the margins. He was managing a dive bar in Washington, D.C. called the Music Box, sometimes referred to as the Jungle Inn, a place far removed from the glory of his prime. The atmosphere at the Music Box was volatile. It was a black and tan club where races mixed illicitly, drawing the attention of both the police and the local underworld figures who controlled the vice trade. Morton was the host, the bouncer, and the star attraction, but he was also a man living in fear. In his letters and later interviews with the Library of Congress, Morton spoke obsessively about the Syndicate. He claimed that powerful forces were blocking his royalties, keeping his music off the radio, and sabotaging his career. He believed they were using voodoo against him, a belief rooted in his New Orleans heritage. He sprinkled mysterious powders around his bed and burned candles to ward off the evil eye. People thought he was losing his mind. But in 1938, the evil he feared manifested in a very physical form. On a humid night in 1938, the tension in the Music Box exploded. Morton got into an argument with a disgruntled associate, a man whose name has drifted into the fog of history but is often described as a local tough guy or a hanger-on with connections to the local racketeers. The dispute was allegedly over money or a perceived slight. Morton, never one to back down, escalated the confrontation, but this time his words were met with cold steel. The assailant pulled a knife and lunged at the jazz legend. The attack was brutal and chaotic. Morton was stabbed in the head and the chest. The blade pierced his lung, a catastrophic injury for a man already suffering from asthma and heart trouble. The violence was bad, but what happened next was a damning indictment of America in the 1930s. Morton was rushed to a nearby hospital, but it was a white-only facility. Despite bleeding from a chest wound, despite being one of the most famous musicians in the world, he was refused treatment. He was left on a stretcher, his life draining away while they argued about the color of his skin. He was eventually transferred to a poorly equipped colored ward at another hospital hours later. The doctors patched him up, but the damage was done. The ice was applied too late. Although Morton didn't die that night, the stabbing was the beginning of the end. He was never the same. He was left physically frail, constantly short of breath, and psychologically shattered. He spent his final 3 years in a desperate, feverish attempt to reclaim his legacy. He drove across the country to California, towing a shabby trailer, telling anyone who would listen that the Syndicate had sent the man to stab him. He believed the knife was just the delivery system for the curse. He wrote frantic letters to the Justice Department and music publishers, claiming a vast conspiracy to steal his royalties and kill him. They want me out of the way, he told friends. They want the jazz, but they don't want the Jelly Roll. In July 1941, Jelly Roll Morton died in a Los Angeles hospital, officially from heart failure and asthma complications, but he told his friends on his deathbed that it was the stab wounds and the voodoo that killed him. He died broke, his diamond tooth gone, his suits threadbare. The inventor in jazz was buried in a pauper's grave, while the swing bands he despised made millions playing the riffs he invented. The gangland connection here is more subtle than a contract hit, but perhaps more terrifying. It represents the systemic crushing of the independent artist by the emerging corporate criminal complex. The Syndicate Morton feared wasn't just a group of thugs, it was the entire machinery of the music business that had been infiltrated by organized crime. They controlled the unions, the booking agencies, and the jukeboxes. If you didn't play by their rules, if you were an arrogant, loudmouthed Creole pimp who demanded his fair share, you were squeezed out. The man who stabbed him at the Music Box was likely just a pawn, a manifestation of the violent environment the mob cultivated in these clubs. Morton's paranoia of being stalked was simply his way of processing the reality that he was being erased by a system that no longer needed him. This story forces us to confront the theft of a legacy. Jelly Roll Morton gave the world the blueprint for jazz. He put the notes on paper, but he died believing that evil spirits and gangsters had conspired to rob him of his creation. The knife wound in his chest was a physical symbol of a broken heart. It is a reminder that the early days of jazz were not a polite tea party. They were a knife fight in a dark room. So I have to ask you, do you think Jelly Roll Morton was truly the victim of a syndicate conspiracy to silence him, or was his paranoia just the tragic result of a fading star unable to accept the changing times? Was the voodoo curse actually just the cold, hard reality of the mob taking over the music business? Tell me your thoughts on the inventor of jazz in the comments below. But while Jelly Roll Morton died a slow death fearing the mob, our next legend died a violent, inexplicable death that looked like a scene from a horror movie. We are leaving the 1930s and jumping to the rock and roll revolution of the 1960s. Our next victim was a star who fought the law, but the law couldn't help him when he was found dead in his car, covered in gasoline. The police called it suicide. The world calls it a message from the Mafia. Get ready for the story of the gasoline execution.
Number 8. Bobby Fuller. We leave the humid, superstitious streets of 1930s Washington, D.C. and travel forward to the blinding sunshine of Hollywood, California. The date is July 18th, 1966. This story takes us out of the jazz clubs and into the burgeoning world of rock and roll. But the shadow looming over it is exactly the same. It is a story that proves the mob didn't just disappear when the swing era ended. They just changed suits and bought record labels. This is the terrifying, bizarre, and infuriating case of Bobby Fuller, the 23-year-old star who sang the anthem, "I Fought the Law." He was hailed as the next Buddy Holly, a clean-cut Texan with a bright future. But his future ended in the front seat of an Oldsmobile covered in gasoline, in what the police called a suicide, but what the entire music industry recognized as one of the most brutal gangland messages ever delivered. To understand why a rising rock star ended up dead in a parking lot, you have to look at the man who owned his career. In the 1960s, the music business was a lawless frontier, and the sheriff of the dark side was a man named Morris Levy. Levy was the owner of Roulette Records and the famous Birdland Jazz Club in New York. He was widely known as the godfather of rock and roll, but his other title was far more accurate. He was a front for the Genovese crime family. Morris Levy didn't operate like a normal CEO. He operated like a gangster. He stole songwriting credits, refused to pay royalties, and used intimidation to keep his artists in line. If you signed with Roulette, you belonged to the mob. And Bobby Fuller had made the fatal mistake of signing with a label that was deeply entangled in Levy's web of influence. By the summer of 1966, Bobby Fuller was waking up to the nightmare of his reality. I Fought the Law was a massive hit, climbing the charts and blasting out of car radios across America. He should have been rich. He should have been celebrating. Instead, he was broke and terrified. He had realized that the contracts he signed were traps. The money wasn't coming. The creative control was gone. Bobby, a headstrong and ambitious young man from El Paso, decided he wasn't going to take it anymore. In the days leading up to his death, he told his bandmates and friends that he was going to break his contract. He was going to leave the label, go solo, and take his music elsewhere. He even had a meeting scheduled with a new manager. In the world of Morris Levy, trying to leave wasn't a business decision, it was an act of treason. The timeline of the murder is a descent into madness. On July 18th, Bobby's mother, Lorraine, found his car parked outside his apartment at 1776 Sycamore Avenue in Hollywood. It was his mother's Oldsmobile, a car he had borrowed. She opened the door and was immediately hit by a wall of heat and the overpowering, suffocating smell of gasoline. Inside, slumped across the front seat, was Bobby Fuller. He was dead.
The condition of the body was shocking and grotesque. Bobby had been dead for hours, baking in the hot Los Angeles sun inside the closed car. His skin was blistered and peeling, not just from the heat, but from the chemical burns of the gasoline that had been poured all over him. But the horror went deeper. The autopsy revealed that Bobby had gasoline inside his stomach. He hadn't just been doused, he had been forced to ingest it. His body was bruised, suggesting a struggle. There was blood on the seat. The scene screamed of a violent, tortured end. It looked like a hit that was meant to be a fire, a torch job to destroy the evidence, but the killers were interrupted or the match had failed to light. Then came the second tragedy, the investigation. The Los Angeles Police Department arrived on the scene and, in a display of staggering incompetence or corruption, ruled the death a suicide. Their theory was that Bobby Fuller, depressed about his career, had driven to his apartment, poured a can of gasoline on himself, swallowed some, and then simply died of the fumes. They ignored the fact that there were no matches found in the car. They ignored the fact that suicide by gasoline without lighting it is unheard of. They ignored the bruises. They even threw away the gas can found in the back seat without checking it for fingerprints, destroying the most critical piece of evidence. The ruling of suicide, later changed to accidental asphyxiation, allowed the case to be closed instantly. No murder investigation, no interviewing of Morris Levy or the heavy-handed associates who had been seen around the band. The gangland theory is the only one that makes sense of the madness. In the mob's playbook, gasoline is a specific tool. It is used to burn evidence, but it is also used to send a message. The theory is that Bobby was kidnapped by enforcers working for the Syndicate interests controlling his contract. They forced him to drink the gas, a torture method used to induce panic and internal burning. Then doused him, planning to set the car on fire to make it look like a tragic accident or a crazy rock star incident. Perhaps they were spooked by a passerby and fled before lighting it, or perhaps leaving him unburned but soaked in fuel was the message itself. You are flammable. The context of Morris Levy supports this. Levy was notorious for his violence. In one famous incident, he beat a police officer who tried to give him a ticket and got away with it. He allegedly dangled Vanilla Fudge's manager out of a window by his ankles. He was a man who viewed musicians as cattle. When Bobby Fuller tried to break the fence, he was slaughtered. The message was received loud and clear by every other artist on the label. You don't quit. You don't ask for royalties. You shut up and sing. The death of Bobby Fuller remains one of Hollywood's darkest cold cases. It is a story of a dream factory that was actually a slaughterhouse. Bobby was the wholesome, handsome face of American rock, the new Buddy Holly, and he was treated like a snitch in a Mafia movie. The official cause of death on his certificate is a lie that mocks justice. It says accident, but the gasoline in his lungs screams murder. This story forces us to confront the corporate gangster. We like to think of the mob as guys in fedoras in dark alleys, but in the 60s, they were guys in suits in boardrooms. They didn't just run the gambling, they ran the radio. Bobby Fuller's death is a terrifying example of what happens when art meets organized crime. He fought the law, and the law might have won, but he also fought the mob, and the mob never loses. So I have to ask you, does the idea of a man pouring gasoline on himself and not lighting it make any sense to you at all? Or is this clearly a botched mob hit designed to silence a rebellious star? Do you think the LAPD was incompetent, or were they paid off to look the other way? Tell me your verdict on the I Fought the Law mystery in the comments below. But while Bobby Fuller's death was a quiet, suffocating horror in a parked car, our next legend's death was a loud, chaotic explosion of violence on a brightly lit street. We are leaving the sunny avenues of Hollywood and heading to the neon strip of Las Vegas. Our next victim was an R&B legend attempting a comeback, but he was gunned down in a drive-by that has never been solved. Was it a random act of road rage, or was it a hit over gambling debts in the city of sin? Get ready for the story of the drive-by in the desert.
Number 9. Cornell Gunter. We leave the sun-baked, suffocating silence of a parked car in Hollywood and travel across the desert to the neon-lit, adrenaline-fueled streets of Las Vegas, Nevada. The date is February 26, 1990. This story takes us to the twilight of a career, to a city that promises second chances but often delivers final endings. This is the story of Cornell Gunter, one of the founding voices of rock and roll, the man who put the swagger into the coasters and gave the world hits like Yakety Yak and Charlie Brown. He was a Hall of Famer, a man who had made the world laugh and dance. But in the winter of 1990, the laughter stopped in a hail of gunfire. Cornell Gunter was executed behind the wheel of his car in a drive-by shooting that remains unsolved, a murder that reeks of the violent transactional nature of Las Vegas, a city where a gambling debt or a moment of disrespect can be paid for in blood. To understand the tragedy of Cornell Gunter, you must understand the strange limbo he was living in. By 1990, the golden age of doo-wop and R&B was long over, but the nostalgia circuit was booming. Las Vegas was the capital of this nostalgia. It was a place where legends went to work when the radio stopped playing their new songs. Cornell was 53 years old. He was working hard, performing at the Lady Luck Hotel and Casino, trying to stage a comeback. But the industry had become a battlefield. The coasters, like many groups of that era, had fractured into multiple warring factions. There were fake coasters touring the country, stealing gigs and money. Cornell was embroiled in bitter legal battles to protect his name and his legacy. He was a man fighting for his identity in courtrooms by day and singing for his supper by night. But there was another shadow hanging over Cornell, one that extended beyond copyright laws. Cornell was known to be a man who enjoyed the Las Vegas lifestyle. He was a gambler. In a city built on losing money, being a gambler is a dangerous profession. The rumors that swirled around the Strip were that Cornell was not just fighting legal battles, he was fighting financial ones. He was living on the edge, navigating the darker side of the city, North Las Vegas, where the glitz of the Strip gives way to the grit of the street. It was here, in this borderland between the tourists and the locals, that his life would end. The timeline of the murder is a chilling example of a Vegas hit. It was a Monday afternoon around 2:30 p.m. Cornell was sitting in his 1978 Chevrolet Camaro at the intersection of Lake Mead Boulevard and Comstock Drive. He wasn't parked in a dark alley. He was on a public street in broad daylight. According to witnesses, he was arguing with a man standing outside the car. The man was described as a heavy-set black male, but his face would never be identified. The argument was heated. Voices were raised. It wasn't a fan asking for an autograph. It was a confrontation. Suddenly, the argument ended. The man on the street didn't throw a punch. He pulled a gun. He fired 2 shots directly through the windshield of the Camaro. The glass shattered. One bullet struck Cornell in the chest, a fatal wound to the heart. In a desperate, dying attempt to escape, Cornell slammed his foot on the gas. The Camaro lurched forward, speeding away from the shooter, but the driver was already fading. The car careened down the street, crossed a median, and crashed into a brick wall a few blocks away. When the first responders arrived, they found the rock and roll legend slumped over the wheel, dead. The police investigation that followed was frustratingly superficial. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department labeled it a homicide, but they struggled to find a motive. Nothing was stolen from the car. Cornell's wallet was still there. This ruled out a carjacking or a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. The shooter wanted Cornell Gunter dead. The lack of robbery pointed the arrow of suspicion towards 2 dark possibilities: a street hit or a contract killing. The gambling debt theory is the most pervasive explanation in the underworld. Las Vegas in 1990 was transitioning from the mob-run era of the 70s to the corporate era of the 90s, but the streets were still controlled by gangs and loan sharks.
If Cornell had borrowed money to fund his legal battles or his lifestyle and couldn't pay, the execution in the street fits the profile of a collection enforcement. A public shooting in daylight sends a message to everyone else who owes money: we will find you. The fact that the shooter walked away calmly and was never caught suggests a level of professionalism, or at least a community too terrified to snitch. The second theory involves the battle of the bands. The legal wars over the coaster's name were vicious. There were millions of dollars at stake in touring revenue. Some have speculated that the violence was an escalation of these disputes, that rival promoters or managers connected to the fake groups might have hired someone to eliminate the competition. While this sounds like a movie plot, the history of the music business is littered with violence over touring rights. Was Cornell silenced because he was the real coaster, standing in the way of a fraudulent payday? Regardless of the specific motive, the method was pure gangland style. Shooting through a windshield is a technique designed to catch the target off guard, trapping them in their own vehicle. It is intimate and distant at the same time. The killer looked him in the eye, fired, and vanished into the desert heat. The death of Cornell Gunter was a tragic footnote in the history of rock and roll. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame just 3 years before his death. He should have been an elder statesman, celebrated for his contribution to culture. Instead, he became a statistic in North Las Vegas. His voice, which had harmonized on some of the happiest songs ever recorded, ended with a scream of tires and a crash of glass. This story forces us to confront the city of illusions. Las Vegas sells the dream of winning, but for Cornell Gunter, it delivered the ultimate loss. It reminds us that the neon lights cast long, dark shadows. A man who fights the law might become a hero, but a man who fights the street usually becomes a memory. So, I have to ask you, do you believe this was a random argument that turned tragic, or does the nothing stolen detail prove this was a targeted hit over debts or business? Is it possible that the fake coasters war turned deadly? Tell me your theory on the Vegas drive-by in the comments below. But while Cornell Gunter was gunned down by a stranger in a car, our final legend was killed by a friend on the steps of his own home. We are leaving the desert and returning to the concrete jungle of New York City. Our final victim was a saxophone giant who played with everyone from Aretha Franklin to John Lennon. He was carrying an air conditioner into his house when he was stabbed in the heart by a drug dealer he tried to shoo away. Get ready for the final chapter, the Brownstone tragedy.
Number 10. King Curtis. We arrive at our final destination, returning to the sweltering concrete cauldron of New York City in the summer of 1971. The date is August 13. This final story does not involve a shadowy contract from a high-rise office or a conspiracy buried in the desert. Instead, it brings us face to face with the most pervasive and terrifying threat of the 1970s urban landscape, the junkie apocalypse. This is the story of King Curtis, a man who was arguably the greatest rock and soul saxophonist who ever lived. He was the musical director for Aretha Franklin, the man who played the opening riff on Respect, and a session giant who recorded with John Lennon. He was a king in the studio, a man of immense stature and respect. But on a hot August night, he was killed on the steps of his own home, not by a rival musician or a jealous lover, but by the chaos of the drug trade that had invaded his neighborhood. He was stabbed in the heart for trying to protect his property, a tragic victim of the street war that was consuming New York. To understand the weight of this tragedy, you must understand the titan that was King Curtis. Born Curtis Ousley in Fort Worth, Texas, he was a force of nature. His saxophone sound was instantly recognizable, a growling, stuttering, soulful roar that defined the sound of 1950s and 60s American music. He didn't just play the sax, he attacked it. He was the secret weapon on hundreds of hit records. When you hear the Coasters' yakety-yak, that's King Curtis. When you hear the soulful backing of Aretha Franklin at the Fillmore West, that's King Curtis conducting the band. By 1971, he was at the peak of his powers. He had just released his own hit single, a cover of Whole Lotta Love, and was working on John Lennon's Imagine album. He was 37 years old, wealthy, successful, and living in a beautiful brownstone at 50 West 86th Street on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. But in 1971, the Upper West Side was not the gentrified safe haven it is today. It was a neighborhood in transition, a battleground. While wealthy artists and intellectuals lived in the brownstones, the streets below were teeming with heroin addiction and crime. The drug epidemic was tearing the city apart. SROs, single-room occupancy hotels, housed addicts and dealers right next door to millionaires. King Curtis was a man who stood tall, a man who didn't back down. He was known for his kindness, but he was also a Texan who believed in defending his castle. He had grown tired of the junkies and dealers using his front stoop as an office and a toilet. He had complained to the police, but in 1971 New York, the police were overwhelmed. If you wanted your stoop clear, you had to clear it yourself. The timeline of the murder is heartbreaking because of how domestic and mundane the activity was. It was a Friday night. The city was baking in a heat wave. King Curtis was coming home from a job, but he wasn't carrying his saxophone case. He was carrying a heavy air conditioning unit. He was doing a chore, trying to make his home comfortable for his family. As he approached his front door, he saw two men sitting on his steps, blocking his path. They were using drugs or dealing or simply loitering with the arrogance that comes from the street. One of them was a 26-year-old junkie and small-time dealer named Juan Montanez. Curtis, balancing the heavy AC unit, asked them to move. He told them to get off his property. Most people would have moved for King Curtis. He was a big man, powerful and imposing. But Montanez was high, or perhaps just desperate and aggressive. He refused. An argument broke out. The street code of the era was volatile. Respect was non-existent. Montanez didn't see a music legend. He saw a man challenging his right to be there. The argument escalated quickly. Curtis, still holding the AC unit, was at a severe disadvantage. He put the unit down, ready to physically remove them if necessary. That was the moment the trap sprung. Montanez pulled a knife. It wasn't a fair fight, it was a street ambush. He lunged at Curtis. The blade struck the saxophonist directly in the chest, piercing his heart. Curtis staggered back, grabbing his chest. Montanez and his accomplice fled into the night, disappearing into the shadows of Central Park. Curtis, bleeding profusely, managed to stumble into his house, collapsing in the hallway. He was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, the sirens wailing through the humid night, but it was too late. The man who had blown the most life-affirming notes in history was pronounced dead less than an hour later. The aftermath was a scene of immense grief. A week later, his funeral was held at St. Peter's Lutheran Church. The turnout was a testament to his greatness. Aretha Franklin was there, devastated. Stevie Wonder, Duane Allman, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson attended. Aretha sang the closing spiritual, "Never Grow Old," and people wept openly in the streets. The king was dead. The police investigation was swift because the community was outraged. Juan Montanez was arrested. He was charged with murder. But the trial was a frustrating display of the legal system's inability to process the chaos of the streets. Montanez claimed self-defense, arguing that Curtis had attacked him. The jury eventually convicted him of second-degree manslaughter, not murder, and he was sentenced to 7 years. 7 years for silencing the voice of a generation. He served his time and was released, a ghost returning to the streets. The gangland connection in this story is not about a specific mafia family, but about the drug cartel of the street. King Curtis wasn't killed by a boss, he was killed by the foot soldiers of the heroin trade. He was killed by the environment that the underworld created. The dealers on his stoop were there because someone higher up, the Syndicate, the suppliers, was flooding the city with product. Curtis was a casualty of a war he didn't start, but refused to surrender to. He died defending the sanctity of his home against the encroaching darkness. The tragedy of King Curtis is the tragedy of a city that ate its own.
He had conquered the world with his music, played in the finest halls in Europe, and recorded with Beatles, but he couldn't walk through his own front door safely. His death marked the end of an era for soul music. The King Curtis sound, that aggressive, happy, growling tenor sax, was silenced forever. This story forces us to confront the price of apathy. The city allowed the drug trade to fester until it consumed its brightest stars. It reminds us that violence is often random, stupid, and irreversible. A knife pulled in a moment of anger destroyed a legacy that took 30 years to build.